The following podcast is an Embassy Row production.
Hey everybody, you're listening to the Coffee and Books podcast. I'm Marc Lamont Hill. I am a professor, a scholar, and most importantly, a book nerd. I say book nerd because I don't just love to read books. I'm the person who loves to read about the book. I love hearing authors talk about how and why they wrote the book. And of course, I love talking to other book nerds about their favorite books. So that's why we started the Coffee and Books podcast. It's a show all about books. Every episode, I will sit down over a cup of coffee with the world's biggest authors to discuss the most interesting, controversial, fun, and important books. Sometimes we'll just hang out with experts, fans, and other guests to talk about some of the greatest books of all time. But it's always about books, and there's always going to be a cup of coffee in front of me. This week, I am joined by somebody pretty awesome. Her name is Mikki Kendall, and her new book is called Hood Feminism, Notes from the Women That a Movement Forgot. Mikki, good to talk to you. Welcome.
Thank you for having me on.
Oh my God.
Fun fact, my nickname in grammar school was Books, so I too am a book nerd.
I
have a book tattoo.
Oh, that's the next level of book nerddom, when you have an actual book on your hand, on your wrist.
Yeah.
That's pretty impressive. So every week I read a book from someone awesome like you, and I come and I sit down with a cup of coffee, and because I'm also a coffee nerd, I change my coffee quite often. This week, though, I went very basic. I'm drinking a plain cup of black coffee. And the reason is because when I was a senior in college, I took a class called The Black Woman. I didn't take it for the right reasons, but every Tuesday and Thursday, I went and I learned a bunch. And I'd pick up my cup of black coffee because I was working a lot, and I'd go in there and we would read books and really learn about Black feminist ideas and the whole Black feminist intellectual tradition. And so when I picked up your book, and this is why I was so excited to talk to you, this book, Hood Feminism, was so much in that tradition of people that I had grown up reading and learned so much from. And I learned so much from your book. And so I was excited to talk to you and happy to have this cup of coffee to bring back those memories. So thank you again.
Thank you.
First of all, congratulations. Your book made the New York Times list. I think it's number 10 this week. And it's months after the book came out. And there's a lot of books on race on the list this week, which is not surprising given everything going on in the world. I'm wondering, though, why a book called Hood Feminism also makes the list. What is it about Hood Feminism that makes the public interested?
So one of the things about this is that race is a part of feminism. Racism has unfortunately been a long-running undercurrent in feminist circles. And one of the things about building a better future is talking about where we were, how we got there, and how we can do better going forward. And Hood Feminism positions feminism in a place to intervene with the world, and specifically in American context, with politics, so that we are doing better by each other. Because right now, in the middle of a pandemic, with the riots and protests and all of these things going on, we're saying, well, why are people angry? Well, they're angry because we haven't done right by multiple communities across time. And hopefully, now that we see how these communities take care of each other, we start talking about how to take care of communities so that we don't get to a point ever again. I know this is wild pie in the sky ideas, where we are watching people be killed on film slowly. We're watching slow motion emotional lynchings. We're watching whole communities that have been deprived of resources suffer. And then we're saying, why are they angry? Well, we know why. It's right there. Maybe we should do something about that before things get worse.
Hood feminism.
Yes.
Why hood feminism?
I'm a Black girl from the South Side of Chicago. I grew up in the hood. The hood is what made me, what raised me. And whenever times have gotten hard for me, the place I could always go back to, the place that's always been safest. I know it's not going to be a safe place, but the safest places have always been in the hood. I still talk to people that I went to grammar school with. I still, even though gentrification has changed a lot about where I grew up, I still have memories of folks who really didn't have anything, still being willing to share with their neighbors. So for me, the hood has never been a hopeless place. It's always been some place where I felt safe and secure, and like my feet could be firmly planted if times got hard.
You know, in the book, one of the things you talk about is the way that mainstream feminism has neglected particular types of issues around poverty, issues around trans identity. I mean, you lay out a range of things, but you also made another move that I thought was interesting. You also say that this idea of womanism also is insufficient at times. So hood feminism becomes a real intervention in the conversation of feminist thought. Can you talk a little bit about what hood feminism as an idea gives us and sort of how it moves us away from traditional feminism and what that all means?
So one of the reasons for hood feminism is because I felt like we had gotten to a place in feminist and in some ways womanist texts that focused less on those without and more on those who had plenty and were looking for more.
Hmm.
And corporate mainstream white feminism is really especially guilty of this, but definitely womanism has sort of tiptoed badly around the edges of embracing gender non-conforming people, trans people, that kind of thing. And I wanted us to start talking about what it means to say, well, we're working toward equality for all, but we refuse to recognize the humanity of some people who we then turn to, right? Your feminist stats about violence, your womanist rhetoric, a lot of it comes out of places where gender nonconforming and trans women and trans men are inhabiting. It comes out of spaces where poor women of color, where poor people of color are really doing the work day to day, right? That life of the mind that a lot of feminist scholars can achieve often comes because someone else is doing this day-to-day work, right? And we're seeing this right now with the pandemic. A lot of essential workers are going to be the same folks who this movement is theoretically for, but we weren't talking about what it meant for them to have a living wage as they take all these risks. We weren't talking about their access to healthcare beyond reproductive, right? Abortion, not saying that abortion isn't an important issue, but if we're talking about trans and gender nonconforming people who might need hormones, who might need a doctor who will see them without all of the judgment, all of these things, we're not doing enough there as a general movement, right? And we can check in, but also then we have to realize that if we're not centering those with police, if we're leaving the hood behind, we're not getting free.
Wow. There are 2 points that came up just now that I want to kind of go in a little bit on so that my audience can really understand just how complex what you're saying is and how helpful it is. The first thing is corporate feminism. And the second thing is womanism. Let's start with corporate feminism. In 2013, Sheryl Sandberg wrote a book called Lean In, Women, Work, and the Will to Lead. And many people trumpeted it as a feminist text. And there were all these conversations about women being able to lead, women having it all of these sorts of conversations that seem to me to be connected to what you're talking about when you say corporate feminism. Can you talk about what corporate feminism is and how books like that may represent it?
So Lean In, a lot of things about being a girl boss, that kind of rhetoric, all sort of hinge on the idea that women have achieved enough, we should be striving to be CEOs, right? And you can run Yahoo or a scam like Theranos or any one of a dozen other things. The Wing comes to mind. And yes, you've got power. What are you doing with that power? You've gotten in a position to lead. You've gotten to a place where you are calling the shots. Unfortunately, when we get to that point in corporate feminism, those shots usually look like not providing childcare, not paying a living wage, letting your staff be abused, being abusive to your staff. You know, there's this whole range of things where we got so focused on power, we never talked about the power to do what. And, you know, this is an old trope of absolute power corrupts absolutely. But also we can't say, well, the world would be better if women were leading it and not talk about the women who have already been leaders and what they've done with that power. And sometimes they've done great things. Absolutely. Sometimes we have seen women do wonderful things, but we've also seen women do horrible things. And so I feel like when we're talking about corporate feminism in particular, too often the rhetoric is around achieving that power. There's nothing built in there about what you're going to do once you get there. You get to be CEO. How did you get to be CEO? Who is taking care of things in your home, the rest of your life, whatever? And what are you paying your employees? Are you making sure that their home lives are okay? Because otherwise, you just got to be equal with another oppressive structure. You became the oppressor. That's not feminism to me. And so there's that. And the damage that it does, unfortunately, we're seeing play out every time a new scandal erupts out of a supposedly feminist place, right? So you've got exposés about conditions at the Wing or at Now, where, yes, these women are leaders. They're also racist. They're transphobic. They are, in the case of Yahoo CEO, who put a daycare set up in her own office, but wouldn't let employees work from home or fund childcare centers to make things easier for employees. they're deciding that they're the exception and they deserve things their employees do not, because there's no accountability to the people who help them get there. So that's my complaint about corporate feminism. It's not so much feminism as it is a brand that you slap on so you can get away with what you want to get away with.
Would it be fair to say that it's simply giving women the freedom to be men, to be patriarchs?
Well, it's giving women the freedom to be oppressors. I think we do a major disservice when we gender binary it as though it's only men or women who can be oppressive, only men, the patriarchy is the patriarchy and definitely it has more power. But I think that historically, so I'm a historian by training, if not all the time, historically we've seen that women get power and sometimes they use it wisely and sometimes they use it poorly. Sometimes men get power and they use it wisely or they use it poorly. Humans are, by and large, regardless of where we are on the gender spectrum, because it's not a binary, it's a spectrum, are going to make their choices based off their own internal compass, not based off genitals or socialized identity or anything else. And the decisions they make really are not going to necessarily be good for other people or bad for other people, because we're all human and humans are fundamentally flawed.
Now, let's talk a little bit about womanism. The term comes from Alice Walker.
Right.
And the idea was to find a space, if I understand correctly, for Black women to think about this issue of race as it intersects with gender, specifically around Black womanhood. How has that helped the conversation and where does it fall short?
So I think it's really important to talk about how race impacts how you're treated. Professor Moya Bailey gave us the term misogynoir to talk about racialized misogyny and specifically how it focuses on Black women. I think womanism does some of that early work. The problem is that womanism doesn't go far enough. And that's not me dunking on Alice Walker. I respect a lot of what she did. But we already knew that gender wasn't binary by the point the term is coined. We'd already had the Stonewall Rebellion. We'd already seen trans voices speaking up. And yet we didn't address a lot of that, right? And so we cannot say that Miss Major and all of these other people who stood up, because LGBTQ rights come out of heavily trans women, trans people, gender nonconforming people fighting that fight and taking the risk. So if we're going to talk about feminism as a movement for all of us, and we're going to say it's not going far enough, it's absolutely true. It wasn't doing enough around race. That just wasn't the only place it wasn't doing enough. And, womanism and womanist theory often fails to talk about and address the idea that gender isn't binary and that being cisgendered and Black, and because you can definitely experience as a darker skinned Black woman, I'm here to tell you, people are quick to decide that they would like to misgender me sometimes as part of misogynoir.
Wow.
Right? So we're definitely experiencing the impact of transphobia. Castor Semenea is one such example. We know that Black women experience this. Serena Williams and Venus Williams have definitely been called over the years various things. Dark-skinned Black women experience this. But womanism didn't really address it. And it didn't address it for cis women, and it certainly didn't address it for trans women, which is why I say it didn't go far enough. That doesn't mean it's not an important step. It doesn't mean that I want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. It just means I want us to keep going, that this movement, which wants so much from these communities, has to start giving back to these communities consistently and showing up consistently.
One of the things you talk about in the opening chapter of the book is something that taught me a great deal, both when you started the hashtag a few years ago and also in the book, and that is solidarity is for white women. What did you mean when you said solidarity is for white women?
So I should preface this by saying I was mad. I know this is will be a shock to your listeners. Sometimes when I get mad, things happen. But I feel like when I said it, I was saying it specifically to a particular situation with a white man who had for some years been harassing young women of color and others, and had been doing so to defend a smaller subcategory of white women. It was a whole mess. You can find the writers. But I also wanted to call out the fact that if we're going to say we're standing in solidarity with each other, that's not a one-way street. It cannot be, I am going to stand in solidarity with, and I want feminism to show up for all women. And then when we can show up for abortion, for certain things, but not show up for gun violence, not show up for police brutality. And I'm going to bring up this in terms of Black Lives Matter versus the Women's March.
But that ain't women's stuff, they say, right? I mean, that's the point.
But Boyd got shot by a cop who shot over his shoulder into a crowd. He wasn't even shooting at her, right? And that's what they'll say. They'll say it's not women. Right. But Ayanna Stanley Jones, Katherine Johnson, I can find you a categorically long list of young women of color, of older women of color, children of color, including young girls in America who are killed by police brutality, who are sexually assaulted. The Daniel Holtzcroft place in Oklahoma is an example. 200 years, because even in Oklahoma, you know it's bad when white men in Oklahoma look at a half-white man and say, you did it, and you should go to jail forever.
Right.
But you know who really brought that case to life, who really kept pushing it largely? Black feminists. Right. White feminism didn't show up until the very end. So when I say solidarity is for white women, it shouldn't be. But too often, even as we say, well, you're Black before you're anything else, or you're whatever, we're so focused on Black women and our votes that we don't talk about white women and their votes and the fact that they vote based on race, as 2016 taught us.
Yeah.
Right? Until it's too late. And so I really wanted the conversation to at least include the concept that if we're going to say feminism and tout that big old banner of all women, 51% of the population, we should probably ask more than showing up from white women. We should probably ask them to do some work. And by ask, I mean tell. And I say that way because I don't really need you to intervene inside my community, but it would be great if you could do something about the racism in your community.
How do we get them to see these issues as women's issues and not as race issues? You know, because I hear white women and white feminists say all the time, yeah, we're sorry Sandra Bland is dead. We're sorry about what happened to Renisha McBride. That's just another example of how Black people are being harmed by the state. And so they see it as a Black person issue and not as a women's issue. I mean, it really goes back to that old thing about all the women being white, right? And so...
Right, and that's where you kind of got to dig in and ask them, why do you think violence against women only counts if women are white? Right? It's a very confrontational thing right now. I'm not going to say it's not. But we've always expressed this as Black people and white women. And I think it's really important to say that Indigenous women, who are more likely to face sexual assault than any other group at the hands of white men, need you to show up and do something. Black women, Latino women, and then gender nonconforming and non-binary folks and trans folks. We all need white women who are, especially in the US, the second biggest voting bloc, to spend less time talking about who we should vote for and more time talking to Aunt Susan over that potato salad full of raisins about what Aunt Susan also make Aunt Susan stop putting raisins.
I was going to say, that's the real crisis of the 21st century, is the raisins still being in the dish in the first place. One of the things you do in this book that I think is really helpful for me was it helped me think about how to frame a variety of public policy issues, you know, whether it's public health, you know, we're talking about violence, in ways that made it a feminist issue for me. I'll give you an example. Gun violence. And obviously, you told a very personal story connected to this as well. But I thought about gun violence as something that Americans deal with. And I thought about gun violence as something that's particular to the hood, right? And all the ways that guns are, you know, are accessed in the hood, the way we're vulnerable to gun violence, all those things. But to frame it as a feminist issue, quite honestly, for me, was eye-opening. I just hadn't thought about it in those terms. Can you say a little bit about how and why it is a feminist issue?
So one of the things about gun violence, and this I'll center it in domestic violence, but it's not just domestic violence. Yes, America absolutely has a gun problem, right? I say this as someone who likes guns and is in the military and goes to the range and all of that, and I still say that we have too many, and they are in the wrong hands. So we can preface it with that. But we know, for instance, that as one of the indicators of the risk of a mass shooter is domestic violence and gun ownership. We know that if you're in a situation, an intimate partner violence situation, and a gun is present, you are more likely as a woman in that situation. Because first of all, you're more likely as a woman in a heterosexual relationship to be in a violent situation. And Black women in particular, 35% more likely than others to be in that situation. You already know, though, that if the gun is present, she's at a greater risk of dying. She's absolutely, we saw this with Marissa Alexander, because of race and gender, unlikely to be able to defend herself with a weapon, despite the narratives we sort of sell that if you own a gun, you can defend yourself, right? We don't really believe that women have selves to defend, and especially we don't believe that Black and brown women have a right to defend themselves. So there's that problem. And then on top of that, when we're talking about it as a feminist issue, as long as we're not addressing the presence of guns in the hands of violent men, we are tacitly saying we are fine with the death. We are going to send thoughts and prayers to people who lose their children, to women who lose their lives, to sisters, to mothers, to brothers. And we center the conversation around gun violence around young men of color in the inner city. And we make it seem like that's where most gun violence happens. But we have mass shootings almost daily until the pandemic.
Yeah.
And you know who's shooting in those mass shootings? Not actually Black men. It is not actually brown people at all for the most part.
White men, right?
Right, it's white men. A white man with multiple guns who is abusive to women in his life is almost universally, right? We have not yet reached the point where we can say factually accurately, I'll admit that, it's 100% of the time, but it's something like 80% of the cases, it's a white man, 80 or 85%. So when we're looking at those numbers, this is where white feminists should be looking around and not making posters showing, rape posters where it's a white woman's face in a Black man's hand. Your focus should probably be on the fact that Uncle Byron owns 872 guns and has been beating Aunt Susan every time she doesn't put raisins in the potato salad. Because quite literally, that man is dangerous. That situation is dangerous. And it's a danger not just to random people in Walmart, to you, to your family. We see these shootings over and over again. And invariably, when they track back to the shooter's house, we find the spouse has been shot. Her sister has been shot. Her other relatives have been shot. There's an abuse of a mother. There's all of these hallmarks, but we don't do anything until the mass shooting, right? It's, mass shootings are unpredictable, as opposed to we know exactly what the recipe looks like because we've seen it over and over. They're not isolated incidents. And because we have not taken it as a feminist issue, violence against women, even though we've had some acts, we've done some things, not great, but okay, we tried. But because we don't take violence against women seriously in general, when it comes to gun violence, it sort of gets stowed under that same rug, right? That we're going to say it's those people in Chicago. I'm a Chicago girl. Everybody wants to, Chirac, Chicago shootings. But when you go and you look at the numbers, all of America has shootings. Every single state, every single county, every major city, and every small town as well has a problem with guns. And often the victims are actually women. But we don't say that. We don't see that. We say it in passing. And then somehow we manage to blame the women. Because I can't tell you how many mass shooters it's been, well, she wouldn't date him. Well, she was taking his kids. Well, she was.
Right.
He murdered her. She didn't do anything wrong.
Hunger. Again, obviously, food insecurity is something that we talk about, again, as an issue of poverty. And we center it in the hood for sure. But food insecurity, food deserts, other forms of insecurity, how do we understand that as a feminist issue, not, again, a function of simply the intersections of poverty and geography?
Well, so first of all, you know who's most likely to be poor? Women. The pay gap, those wealth gaps that we talk about, those are gendered. And then if it's a woman-led household post-divorce, as was my case, or a death or whatever, we then run into, issues like childcare, location, whether or not the grocery store that's closest to you has decent food, because we sort of bury this in food desert. But we all have definitely been, if you've been in the hood or in a rural area, you've walked in a grocery store where you walked in and you knew nothing in here should be purchased. Absolutely not, right? It's moldy on the shelf. You can smell the meat counter, whatever. Well, you can't shop there, so you got to spend money elsewhere. And so one of the reasons I bring up hunger in specific in this way is because we tend to act as though not being able to feed your family a healthy diet is somehow a moral failing, right? But we know, aside from the wealth gap in general and pay gaps in general, that even if you're making theoretically enough, you still get all these other obstacles. And especially if you're a single parent, or I think it's like 35 or 40% more likely to be in poverty if that single parent is a woman. So if we're doing all of that stacking up and we're saying, well, women-led households have less money, and women-led households are more likely to be in areas where they struggle with, food insecurity, whether it be because of food desert or poor quality or a dozen other things, dirty water, right? Because Flint is not the only place with lead in the water. So we stack all these obstacles up. And then we say, but it's not a feminist issue. So the girls who can't eat, the women who are going without to feed their kids, the communities that we already know in other countries do better when women and their families are healthy. That doesn't stop being true inside the US. And we saw even during the riots, heavy air quotes here, when we really looked at what the looters were taking, a lot of them took food.
Yeah.
A lot of them took basic needs. Yeah, sure. Someone's going to show me a video of TV or that one white girl running with her lamps at a Target. And that happened. But a lot of what we saw people loading up on was the most basic toilet paper, paper towels, food kind of things, because that's what they couldn't afford. That's what they were going without in those areas.
Yeah.
And they had a store right there that they couldn't afford to go in, or that didn't necessarily treat them well when they went in.
Which is a great point you made in the book, by the way, was that, we sometimes think about food insecurity purely through the lens of the desert, right? The place is 5 miles from here. And you said it could be right next door, but it doesn't matter if you can't afford it.
Right. If you put a Whole Foods in the hood and you don't change that Whole Foods prices, well, I call Whole Foods whole paycheck still.
Right. Exactly. Let me pivot for a second, because one of the things you talk about, and you start the book with your grandmother, which I found very helpful for a variety of reasons. She's of the same generation as my father. They're 4 years apart. And this idea of feminism, you said, for your grandmother wasn't a language she would use. There are parts of it, of even her own sort of way of navigating the world, that might not cohere with feminism. But there are these other ways that very squarely do. And that seems to be the story of lots of Black women and the experience of lots of Black women throughout history. Can you talk a little bit about your grandmother and why you frame her the way you do? Because I thought it was such a loving and careful depiction.
So my grandmother was one of those women who, she had always worked. I never engaged with a world where women didn't work. I know that this has been a tenet of certain aspects of feminism. She always worked. We all always worked. Working wasn't optional. There was no debate or discussion on that front. And then on top of that, listen, education was not optional. I understand that there are people in the world who can drop out of school. I don't know them. That was not my reality. I tried to float the idea of getting my GED early once, and that woman who had just had a radical mastectomy yoked me up. Like,
wow.
She snatched me so hard, I was like, okay, well, I'm going to school. Please let me breathe. But she did all of those things because she wanted us to have access to opportunity. Was it always the best way? Was it always the most feminist way? No, she was operating from a completely different world, functionally, right? My grandmother was born in 1924. So she lived through Jim Crow. She's raising me in the 80s, right? 60 years of her life have already gone by when I'm hitting puberty. And she's watching her rogue granddaughter, because I really was not necessarily a shock. I know I was not necessarily the most well-behaved child, make decisions that she couldn't have considered in her time, not because she wouldn't have, but because these things didn't exist.
What kind of decision?
I joined the Army because I wanted to. I didn't have to necessarily, in the sense that I probably could have gotten a job. I could have met someone, gotten married, all of those things, right? I didn't join to be a secretary. I joined originally to be a helicopter mechanic. I changed to be a stevedore, and later I was a combat medic, because that I had all of these choices in front of me. I couldn't afford college without it, and home with my parents wasn't maybe my greatest moment, so we needed to part ways. But she was watching her grandchild, who was climbing trees and running wild and, doing all of these things, make choices that simply didn't exist. She couldn't have joined the military and then chosen her job. She couldn't have chosen to just chuck respectability to the wind and carry on necessarily, even though she had pushed all of us to do our best to have access to opportunity. I imagine that there are probably moments, if she were still alive, where she even now would look at me and just be like, what goes on in there? Because I didn't do the right thing. I didn't go to college after I'd had kids. I didn't focus on, getting the good government job first, or any of the other things that would have been safe for her. My grandmother was rogue enough in that, quite literally, the rule for all of us was the one job we could never have. We couldn't go in a white woman's kitchen. What we absolutely could never do, as far as she was concerned, she had worked too hard, they had come too far. Domestic service was not on the table. So then here she's got these children and grandchildren, and most of us, they got married, they got regular jobs, and went to school, whatever. But then here I come, and I'm like, so I'm going to go live in Germany because I want to, and the army will let me, right? When I decided to divorce my ex-husband, everyone said, well, what are you going to do with your child? We're going to college because we go. I had him. He comes with me.
Right.
These are not the options that would have necessarily been true 10 years earlier, 20 years earlier. And so I think a lot of times when we think our elders don't understand us, they don't, but it's not because they're not necessarily trying. My grandmother always tried. But some of this was just beyond anything that she could have had as an option as a Black woman during Jim Crow.
But there would be some traditional liberal feminists, and I can say probably liberal white feminists, who would say your grandmama wasn't no feminist because she wanted you to get married. She wanted you to act like a lady, that she had a certain kind of respectability around certain kinds of things, gender respectability, that would make her not a feminist. Where's that blind spot for mainstream liberal feminism in terms of how they understand how Black women navigate the world and how Black women have to do their feminism?
I mean, blind spot comes in the idea that what is a choice for them, what is safety and freedom for them is the same for us. We never had to fight to be able to work. So our concerns weren't really around the workplace. We could always go to work. Anybody ever stop a Black girl from getting a job? They might treat her like crap when she gets there, but going to work wasn't a problem. But having our marriages be respected, my grandmother's grandparents had been enslaved. So them being able to get married and stay together after the end, because they stole themselves. They ran away together. They become a couple that is able to raise their own children. That's freedom in her head. Because before them, their siblings, so much is already lost because being sold. So her structure is going to be different. Her mother was the first woman in our family that could legally read.
Wow.
For my grandmother to be able to read was a big deal, and to be able to go to school, to be able to see her children go to college. And only one of my aunts went to college, but then here I come and I'm going to school, and my cousins are going to school, and we're first ginning that college experience. And to see me say, well, I'm going to go across, because it's just what she called it, across the water. I'm going to go across the water to Germany because I want to do that thing. I want to travel. I want to whatever. See my aunts, Aunt Denise is who I most of was raised by. To see my aunt do a lot of those things. This is a whole new world. To then say, well, you're not feminist because your priorities don't match a white woman's whose family didn't come out of slavery, who wasn't coping with Jim Crow oppression and all of that. That's a good way to get, well, we're not going to finish this sentence, but let me say that you shouldn't say that to my face about my grandmother.
Let me ask you a question about this other respectability thing. One of the places that you sort of talk about Black feminists, Black forms of feminism, Black womanism in particular falling short, is around things like sex work and other things that traditionally we've seen as bad choices. I mean, there are moments where we'd say that a person who's engaged in what we then would call prostitution was doing anti-feminist work, right? That she was being used for her body, and that she wasn't free because she was succumbing to a man's desires in as a form of payment, or even a stripper, right? We'd say, oh no, that's anti-feminist. Now, at this juncture in history, we seem to be looking at these issues differently. How does a hood feminism and other progressive and radical forms of feminism help us understand sex work as not anti-feminist and maybe even the embodiment of feminism?
Being able to own your own body is still relatively new for many of us, we'll put it that way. Being able to decide what happens to it, what you do with it, and being the one to profit from these things are all concepts people struggle with, right? And we want to say that your behavior with your body somehow impacts everyone else. And in theory, sure, we're all operating in the same world. But arguably, if we're going to say that choice is a factor in feminism, then you've got to be willing to understand that people make choices based off their situation, not off a situation that they are not inhabiting, not off what would be best for you, person riding around in a completely different meat suit, doing a completely different thing with a completely different background. Obviously, trafficking and other things are a problem, but that's not the same as choosing sex work. That's not the same, especially in a country that was built on vice, right? American wealth, success, whatever you want to call it, whether we're talking about the kidneys and bootlegging or what is currently happening with the occupant of the White House, has always relied kind of on crime. We venerate it when men are doing it, right? We've all, Chicago, so we're going to talk about the St. Valentine's Day Massacre and Al Capone and all of the movies we make about the 40s, and we love that. We love the Untouchables, love all of these things. But when women are choosing for themselves, when people who are not men are choosing, not cisgender, are choosing for themselves what they want to do, suddenly we get very concerned about the morality and respectability. But somebody is paying them. We focus so much on the people who are doing sex work and very little about the customer base for sex work. You know what makes sex work go away? People not hiring sex workers. You know what would make illegal gambling or drugs or whatever? All of these things go away without a customer. They exist because there's a demand for them. And there's a reason we refer to it as one of the world's oldest professions. And I think, and this is a thing I say a lot, if we're only going to give people bad choices, we can't be upset that they don't be good or what we think of as good. A lot of people who we see going into sex work are doing so because that is work that they can do that pays enough to live off of.
Right.
And I know someone's going to say you can get a job at McDonald's. And the last time I checked the McDonald's page, I want to say it's $10 or $12 an hour here in Illinois. In order to get a 1-bedroom apartment, I want to say now, and I have kids, so it's been a little bit, but I want to say now in Chicago, it's something like $1,200. It might be $1,400 for a 1-bedroom. Please tell me on $10 an hour how you're going to afford a roof over your head.
Right.
And sure, we can say go to college and all of these things. But right now, we're in the middle of the pandemic. There's not a lot of jobs. You know who is actually still able to afford to pay some of their bills? That is not the privileged, sort of middle class, upper middle class elite with deep pockets or work from home jobs. That's going to be people engaged in vice. We made a lot of things illegal, right? My grandmother ran numbers. She was a policy caller. Don't remember the actual term, but a man named Policy John is one of the people who taught me how to do multiplication. Policy was illegal, but now we have the lottery.
Right. It's criminalization, right? It's taking ordinary human acts and deciding arbitrarily somewhat whether they're crimes or not. That's helpful for helping me think through. Again, my encounter with Black feminist thought has sort of made that clear to me that it's just labor.
Right.
But figuring out how to have that conversation with a broader audience about these topics is super helpful. And quite honestly, your book has been so helpful for that. You made a decision to not speak to academics and speak to the academic canon. You decided to write a book that everybody could read. I mean, there's something really cool about writing a book about hood feminism, but also that the hood can read. Why that choice?
So here's the thing. I understand that academics talk to each other a lot. And I know that I have kind of a rep of being anti-academic. And I'm not anti-academic. Can't be. I have a master's. I can't. I was in the academy. But I am anti-creating obstacles to people understanding who don't have access. I know because I had to join the Army to pay for the first degree, and then I had a job to help me pay for the second degree and all of that, how much college costs. You shouldn't need $100,000 plus degree to be able to talk about your life, to be respected in a conversation about your life. And for me, pre-degrees, pre any of that, one of the things I had noticed was that so many of these books talk about girls like me. They don't talk to us. They don't listen to us. I know there's a narrative that like Black girls don't read or people in the hood don't read, but I grew up surrounded by books. I grew up being given books by people who said, oh, books, I know you love books. Here, let me give you something else. And they were folks who drove cabs, who did hair. I don't know how people think the world outside of the academy functions, but honestly, everybody reads. It's just that the average American reads the 7th to 10th grade level. So the longer the words, you're not making it smarter. You're just creating new obstacles. You don't need to say praxis when you can say practice. I promise, we don't need a $10 word for everything.
What else does academic feminism get wrong? What do in terms of their approach, or either in terms of their method or in terms of their approach or whatever?
Listening. I understand it can be difficult when you've done all of this schooling to hear that you don't know everything. But none of us know everything. None of us has experienced everything. None of us has been everywhere. And if you have, you're a vampire, and I would love to interview you. That's a separate conversation. But by and large, when we're talking about the academy, it's really easy to get in that ivory tower and close the gate behind you and think, because you're up here looking out at the world, that those people don't have any answers and they don't know anything. I'm going to point out, especially right now in the depths of COVID and everything else, that the folks that we relied on the most, the folks who made getting through the pandemic possible, they weren't in the tower. They were the people who built the tower. They're the people who take out the garbage. They're the people who make sure your toilet worked, that your groceries got delivered to you, right? The thing people were most upset about was the sudden realization that they couldn't get their hair done, their eyebrows done, their nails done. Those folks don't have less value because they don't have the same kind of degree.
You are in the military. You didn't identify as a feminist when you're in the Army.
I did not identify as a feminist, but I definitely felt left out, right? There was that point where a lot of feminist rhetoric sort of trundled right over. I know, and it's not a knock against Jane Fonda at all, because I respect a lot of Jane Fonda's work, but there was sort of this idea that you couldn't be feminist and also be someone who wasn't a pacifist, that you needed to have a certain relatively rigid set of beliefs. And it hadn't yet been exposed to the idea that white mainstream feminism wasn't really for me, and that me trying to cut myself apart to fit into the box wasn't going to work. That came later.
Yeah.
But I didn't identify as a feminist because I didn't see any value in it for Black girls or Black girls in the military or people who weren't white, really. They really weren't talking about it. You know, it's the 90s. And the 90s version of feminism, which was a lot of girl power, I'm going to point to the Spice Girls and remind you that we had Baby Spice and Sporty, and then we had Scary Spice as Black girls.
Of course.
That racism that was bleeding out of feminism all over the 90s girl power stuff, that's not for me.
Wow. So what was your introduction in terms of books? What was your introduction to feminism? What was the text that was accessible to you that made you say, hey, I need to think about these issues more deeply?
Oddly enough, it was fiction. It was Color Purple.
Really?
It was actually Alice Walker, yeah.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. I actually got into that book. I read that book so many times. I read that book more times than we can even begin to discuss. And one of the things that stuck out to me and continues to, and I know that there are other things to say about her anti-Semitism and other things, I'm not going to put her on a pedestal, but I don't believe pedestal anyway, was how deeply she interrogated what it meant to be someone like Suge who broke away versus being someone like Celie. And it's not that she lacked the courage, but who had been battered until she couldn't construct breaking away. So she'd sacrificed herself to save her sister from what was happening. And the different paths their lives all took. And one of the things that sort of gets buried in conversations, and I actually keep forgetting what I'm saying, is that when Nellie goes to Africa with her family, the missionary's wife is very respectable, but she's also vicious. And I started to really get into thinking about what it would mean to be a woman who did all the right things and got nothing out of it. To then watch what is happening around you. And also what it would mean to be someone like Celie who suffered and kept suffering and couldn't conceive at first that she didn't have to suffer. And so I started reading other texts as a result of reading that, of, you know, my feminism came by way of Black women. So I read a lot more Toni Morrison, I read more Alice Walker, I read some bell hooks. And then I went back and I seen Gloria Steinem and others in passing or read selections from their work, but I had never felt any connection. So reading Black voices, Black feminist voices and Black womanist voices, and then going back to their work, I could then look at it through a different lens. But originally, it just felt foreign to me.
So you read Alice Walker, you read Toni Morrison, you read bell hooks. What about
Ida B. Wells Barnett, too.
Ida B. Wells, of course. And again, thinking about that as a feminist, as thinking about Ida B. Wells Barnett's work as feminist as opposed to just sociological or journalistic, but to frame it as feminist is also a very interesting intellectual move that you're making that makes total sense. But again, I think a lot of us haven't been trained to think about it in that way. What about folk who came in, speaking of the 90s, like say a Joan Morgan, Chicken Heads Come Home to Roost, those kinds of books, how did they...
I read that. I read Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together, Warmth of Other Tongues, Jim Crow. I read a lot of that. And part of what, for me, was a little bit more awkward was the realization as someone who might at one point have been referred to as a chicken head based off appearance, if not behavior. Not that Joan Morgan was judging me, but how many people were judging, even within feminist spaces, the Black girls who didn't fit a more middle class and above mold, right? I'm someone who'll tell you, I'm a little ghetto sometimes. I am. I don't think that that's bad, but I think that sometimes people are very uncomfortable realizing that one of those people is at the table with because we're still those people, right? I lived in the projects. I was on food stamps as an adult. You know, no one was paying my rent in my 20s except me and the state. And I felt as I was reading later texts that the middle classness of it all, not that I'm not now in that place financially, ignored how difficult it was to be one of the girls who was smart in the hood, who was sexually available, promiscuous, whatever, because she was working out her own things. Because it wasn't, even though I know people sort of interpret it this way when they're talking about video girls or Corinne Steffens or whatever, it wasn't like, again, we were necessarily folks who had the best choices available. So we were working off what we had at any given point. And sometimes you make great decisions. Surprise, good things come out of it. Sometimes, though, that bad choice and that bad choice, and you have to pick the lesser of the evil.
Right.
And so for a lot of those texts, I didn't feel like that was there. Not that they didn't cover other things. I didn't broaden my horizons. It was just, I started to feel like, okay, there's this whole space, right, that is just sort of sitting there, right? And it's the non-hotep girl from the hood.
Right.
Because I, surprise, did not come out of any of this thinking that I needed to be following some man.
That's an important non-takeaway. I want to talk a little bit about your writing process for a couple of reasons. The first thing is you weave so much memoir and self-reflection into your writing. I read this book, I learn about your grandmother, I learn about your high school situation, I learn about confronting domestic violence, I learn about relationships that don't work out, marriages that don't work out. How challenging is it to tell those types of stories on the page? Particularly since a lot of those people are still alive and can read it and see it.
If it happened, it happened. I'm going to talk about it. I refuse to be ashamed of surviving. I refuse to be ashamed of not making the best choices when I didn't know any better. And I refuse to be ashamed because shame serves no purpose. It absolutely, shame is one of those emotions like panic that really doesn't do a lot of good for you in a crisis. But also because it's life. And I wanted to make sure people understood that you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to have always made the right decisions. And I didn't want to sit on a high horse and say, well, look, this is what you're doing wrong. And not admit that I did wrong, that I made bad decisions, that I wasn't always, and woke is a word that's loaded with some other stuff, but I wasn't always aware or tapped in or whatever, because I wasn't, right? We should all understand that this is a process. This is a growth meeting. You've got to grow up, and then you've got to grow up some more. And it's a lifelong thing. I am certain in 20 years, I will be highly problematic for something. I will screw up. I don't intend to sign a letter that says no one can ever critique me. A deal with friends to come club me upside the head before I put a letter in Harper's that says I'm upset that folks have said I said bad things. But
for example.
But I understand that if we stop telling people that we're perfect, if we cop to the fact that we're imperfect, we could maybe have a more genuine conversation. I won't say it wasn't difficult at all, but it wasn't as though my past was going to rewrite itself if I ignored it.
Do you write to other feminists? I understand you're writing for a broader audience, but is there part of you that also wants to be sort of accepted into the canon of Black feminist literature? Like, do you think, I wonder what Bell Hooks is going to say when she reads this. I wonder if Joan Morgan's going to take this up. I wonder if Patricia Hill Collins loves this. Like, I know when I write, that's one of the things I think about. I don't write for those people, but I'd be lying if I said part of me doesn't wonder how they're going to take up the work.
I wonder how they're going to take it up, but here's where I admit that I am also somewhat spiteful. And this is petty. It is petty, five petty. That's me. If I made you mad before, how mad are you now? How upset are you now? Because I definitely wanted that space that I felt was missing to have something in it and to open the door to other girls like me, other people. I am not necessarily a person who hero worships in the way that would make sense to anyone else. The people who I look up to the most are not necessarily people who have letters behind their name. The author who I most want to like my work, Mildred Taylor, and if Toni Morrison were still alive, or Terry McMillan, who I talked to, which was amazing, the people I most want to like my work are other Black women and creators who also step outside the narrow lines, right? I was the kid that scribbled in my colors and never stayed in the lines. And the people I look up to are the kind of folks who broke new ground. I do wonder if other Black feminists are going to be cool about it, if they're going to like it or not. But ultimately, we all have our lanes. If they are with it, cool. If you're not, that's fine. Because if I'm being honest, I don't like all of their work. I can't expect everyone to like all of mine.
That's a fair way to think about it. Talk to me about your writing process. Do you write every day?
I do not write every day. I write in big chunks. So I'm writing, but not actually typing, where I just let things kind of percolate in the back of my head until it feels like it's there. Because to me, there's nothing more useless than staring at a blank page when there are no words there. Sitting here for 6 hours.
You've described my daily writing process, by the way.
Yeah, that cursor is not your friend. So I will go do something else. I am that person who gets my house clean, right? I decorate my office. I, cooks, whatever. But in the back of my head, whatever I want to talk about is percolating, and eventually it will come together. And then I'll sit down and I basically word vomit around 800 or 1,000 or sometimes 5,000 words in a day. When I run out of words, then I go do something else again. I take a nap, I take a shower, I take a walk. I have this thing now lately where I've been doing these combat workouts I found on YouTube until it is time to edit. And I can't say I always know when it's time to edit, but it's like a dance in my head. Okay, I've got words. Okay, I'm ready to go back to those words. So my rough drafts get written. I'm going to sound like a real jerk. My rough drafts get written in around a month and a half.
Wait, for like a whole book?
Yes. It doesn't mean that it's a good thing anyone ever sees.
I just need to say, in the 15 years that I've been a professional journalist, I've never hated a guest before. When you tell me you draft your book in a month, I don't even know what to say. I'm enraged and jealous.
I mean, to be fair, though, Mark, you have to understand what that starts as. It's almost like Clayface, right? Like it's just a big pile of clay.
Okay.
And I got to go back, right? And then, so I had a bunch of essays that were sort of vomited up out of my brain. And then I went back and I selected the essays that flowed together and reworked them. And then I show it to like 7 friends. I have a group of friends that will take a look at my stuff and they'll give me notes. And then I'll go back with their notes. Then maybe finally I give it to my editor. Because if you ask my editor, it takes a lot longer than 30 days. My editor wanted to fight me. Georgia Barnard Viking was just like, give me the paycheck. And then when I finally gave them to her, she was like, so why were we waffling? And I was like, because you never saw a rough draft. You're never going to see a rough draft.
Gotcha.
No one. Quite literally in my will, it specifies that my rough drafts will all be destroyed.
Are you serious?
No one will ever see my unpublishable work. Yes.
Wow. I get it. I don't share drafts either. I don't really, I don't write that way either. I tend to just work on a sentence until it's perfect, then I have 2 sentences, and then I have 3 sentences. And so it may take me 6 months but I don't really end up with drafts of books. I end up with books. But it just takes me forever to get there. And so and editors like me when I turn it in because they don't have a lot of work to do, but they hate me until I turn it in because they're like, we don't even know if there's really a book. There's like a rumor of a book to them. Like they don't necessarily believe that I have anything. And sometimes I don't, but then when I do, it's done. So
right, and that's the thing. By the time I turned in, this book has been shaped up enough that now my editorial notes are questioned as opposed to what the hell is this page on?
What's this book about? No, that's fair. Before you go, I am going to subject you to my favorite game. Mainly because it tortures the guests. You'll love it at the same time that you hate it. The game is called Buy It, Borrow It, or Burn It.
This is definitely a trap.
I'm going to give you 3 books. No. I'm going to give you 3 books, and one you buy, one you borrow, and one you burn.
Okay.
Book number 1, ironically, The Color Purple by Alice Walker. Book number 2, Their Eyes Were Watching God, Zora Neale Hurston. Book number 3, Beloved, Toni Morrison.
Actually, I'm about to make people really upset, and here's why. I'm going to buy Color Purple because my copies always take a walk. I am going to borrow Their Eyes Were Watching God because I've read it a bunch. I know I love it. It's not one of my favorite books. I am going to burn Beloved because Beloved is the book that made me cry the hardest in my life. I hate that book. It was beautifully written. The story is amazing. That book made me sob. I was mad at Toni Morrison for a smooth 2 years because that book broke my heart.
That's an
and
interesting...
It's not beautifully done.
It's a masterpiece.
I never want to read Beloved again. I never, ever want to break my heart that way again. I feel that way about some of Octavia Butler's work too. I don't like books that make me sob.
Mm.
I don't want to cry in a movie. I don't want to cry from a book. I like my escape. But also, Beloved haunted me. I know Toni Morrison has passed on. May she rest in power. But no one with that level of talent should have written a book that stabbed people in the heart like that.
Beloved does haunt you. It breaks your heart. It also inspires you and makes you think about all kinds of things in different ways. I didn't expect you to say that. Actually, I had Alice on my list before we started talking, but after you mentioned how much The Color Purple meant to you, I said, okay, that's a relatively easy choice for you. And I was also thinking as a feminist, you know, there are so many interesting feminist themes that run through Color Purple, including that of pleasure and desire. I mean,
Right.
part of Silly's liberation is that.
Right.
Is the whole button thing. And, you know, as she calls it, as Alice Walker calls it, and sort of being able to explore her own body and her own pleasure. So I was like, all right, she's probably going to hold on to that. I said, the eyes were watching God. I thought maybe that might be because I try to figure out how to torture the guest. And I thought maybe the idea again of liberation.
I don't actually love Their Eyes Were Watching God, but Beloved and I have beef. We have emotional, because I read it right after I had a baby.
Oh.
I read that book literally 2 weeks after my oldest was born.
Oh, man. Yeah, you ain't stand a chance.
I quite literally cried so much over that book that my grandmother sent my grandmother intervened a lot early on in my parenting cycle, sent one of my aunts over to take it from me. She called me because I read really fast. So I read the whole book basically in a day. I was breastfeeding. My child was nursing every 2 hours, so I might as well read while we're sitting here because it's only so long we can do this. And I can stay awake. She called me and I was bawling and she's like, what's wrong? Who am I killing? Who am I sending over? You know, and I'm trying to explain. And she literally called one of my cousins and was like, she has a book. Go take that book from her.
Yes.
Go get that book.
And if you haven't read Beloved, and by the way, you can grab all the books that we're talking about at bookshop.org and just go to Uncle Bobby's and grab these books. But of course, in Beloved, I mean, one of the central themes is the haunt. Literally, she said it's a haunting book, and in some ways, it's a perfect word because they are literally haunted by this baby. And you're wrestling with this question of, I mean, one of the key questions is during the time of slavery, what do you do to resist? And some people kill children, some people kill babies. And you 2 weeks postpartum, I could see how.
I'm still in my feelings, Mark.
All right. I ain't gonna make you cry. I ain't gonna make you cry, but I will just say Beloved for me is a stunning book. It's a beautiful book. We'll probably do a whole special episode on it because there are so many beautiful things about that book that still make me tear up. I don't know if I go all the way in and cry on that book. I do that more for The Color Purple.
I can see that. And honestly, I think if I read it at a different time, I might have felt differently about it. But because I read it in the depths of hormones,
right?
The idea of what, and I'm not going to give it away, but there's a scene with a baby in particular.
Yeah.
That I was looking at my child and I'm reading this book. And I'm telling you, quite literally, my grandmother was like, somebody has to she can't ever see this book. It has to get up out of her house because this thing is making her crazy. She didn't even know what book it was at first. She knew I had a book and I was trying to explain. And so then when my cousin came to get the book, and you have to understand my grandmother to understand it. Yes, absolutely. She sent an adult to another adult's house to take their book. And this is perfectly fine. And I gave it to him. And he looked at it and he was trying to figure out, and the one page, because I sobbed all of this one page. So he opens it, looks at this page. He starts reading it. He looks at me and he says, who the hell gave you this? Who let you have this?
Right. This is hilarious, right? Because you would think you're like a teenager caught with like a dirty magazine or something, right, as opposed to like the Nobel Prize winning novel from Toni Morrison. But they were right. Toni will do that to you, man. Toni.
Right.
Woo.
That was too much. That was too much talent.
Too much talent.
Right? Like, this is the thing. It's not that what she did was wrong. It was just, I don't know how you read a book like Beloved and then ever open your mouth to say that slavery wasn't cool. Ever open your mouth to ignore its impact and whatever, because I felt like I was there. I felt like that was my baby, the baby I was holding, and I was a mess.
Oh my God. Yeah. So many scenes about, I may have to bring you back. No, maybe I won't. I'll bring some folk back. We're going to have a conversation about Beloved and how it means. But before we go, I mean, I'm glad to talk about these things because again, I think that there's a way that we reduce feminist literature and feminist writing to just the nonfiction text and just the theory, the hardcore theory and all that stuff. But in each of these texts that we talked about, especially Beloved and The Eyes Watching God and Color Purple, There's some real conversations about what it means to be human, what it means for women to take control of their own lives and what to do with their own bodies and the choices that they're making. That's deeply tied up.
And for me, a lot of it was about the fact that literary canon is where Black women established their humanity in American literary canon, right? Consistently. Not that Phyllis Wheatley didn't exist in all these things, but that there's this period where with Alice Walker and Toni Morrison and Terry McMillan, where we suddenly have this breadth of representation and multiplicity that we had seen some of in the Harlem Renaissance, and we had seen some of it in the Chicago Renaissance with Gwendolyn Brooks. But suddenly we now have this fully formed canon of Black lit that centers women and girls and being not a man, right? That makes it possible for us to be fully human and fully recognized, and our pain, as well as our joy, to be treated as a central thing. And so for me, I think that if you are not reading Black feminist fiction, you are missing so much.
Wow. Well, that's a lesson for me. I need to really go even more deeply into Black feminists. I mean, obviously I own a bookstore, so I get to read a lot of stuff and I get to see some of the cutting edge stuff, but there's so much more out there. And we're going to put together a book list actually on the website so we can do that too. I'm going to ask for your help.
Yes, and I'm going to tell you, I'm N.K. Jemison's Inheritance Trilogy, which will also make you sad and you'll feel a lot of ways in 5th season. I'm going to suggest that people, step out into the comics and the sci-fi. I do those things too, but also a lot of other Black feminist voices are there. And we are all over your genres. Come out here and play with us.
Sounds like a plan. Yo, Mikki, thank you so much for joining me. It was like an absolute pleasure having you. And I can't wait to hear what all those amazing reviews come back and say about your book. Because even though you don't care what they say, I know they're going to be really, really good, because this is a major intervention into the conversation and something that everyone in the world should read it to really understand. It's called Hood Feminism, Notes from the Women That a Movement Forgot. Mikki, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me. And this was great. I would love doing it. Everyone should do your show.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of Coffee and Books. If you want to purchase any of the books discussed on today's episode, go to UncleBobbies.com. That's Uncle BOBBIES.com.